Wood splintered, not the clean snap of dry kindling, but a violent, tearing groan that rattled the trapped dust from the ceiling joists. Iron hinges shrieked in the dark. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He just dragged the freezing mountain air and the sharp scent of pine tar right into her cage. Iron sliding into a greased strike plate makes a heavy, sickening sound. It was a thick, wet clack that vibrated through the floorboards and settled deep in the hollow of Abigail's stomach. She didn't pound her fists against the wood. She didn't scream. The time for screaming had ended an hour ago, right around the time her father's backhand split her lower lip against her teeth. The metallic copper tang of her own blood was still fresh on her tongue. She simply pressed her forehead against the rough grain of the oak door, closing her eyes as the heavy, dragging footsteps of Josiah Miller retreated down the narrow stairwell. Every creak of the steps felt like dirt being shoveled onto a coffin lid. Her room was an oven. It was late August, the kind of unrelenting, stagnant heat that baked the alkaline dust of the prairie right into your pores. The single, narrow window was nailed shut Josiah's doing, completed weeks ago when he first noticed her lingering too long, looking at the horizon. The air inside smelled of old wool, lye soap, and the sour sweat of her own fear. Abigail backed away from the door, her boots scuffing against the warped pine floorboards. Her hands were shaking, not with rage, but with a pathetic, deeply ingrained terror. She hated herself for it. She wanted to be the kind of woman in the dime novels, the ones who spat fire and possessed an unbreakable spirit. But she wasn't. She was 22, exhausted, and her left eye was swelling shut. Her shoulders ached from years of hauling cast iron washpots, and her spirit felt like wet paper. Josiah was downstairs, uncorking the cheap rye whiskey he bought by the gallon. She heard the glass clink against the tin cup. He was celebrating. Tomorrow morning, he would unlock the door, drag her by the hair if he had to, and load her into the back of Amos Thorne's wagon. Amos was the town butcher, a man who smelled perpetually of raw suet and stale pipe smoke, whose hands were permanently stained pink, and who had offered her father 3 head of cattle and the cancellation of a gambling debt in exchange for a quiet, obedient wife. When she had told her father she would rather walk into the river with rocks in her pockets, he had laughed. A dry, hacking sound. Then he had hit her. "You'll wet him, Abigail," he had spat, the stench of chewing tobacco thick on his breath. "Or you'll rot in this room until your ribs poke through your dresses and you beg me for a scrap of gristle." She sank onto the edge of her narrow mattress. The corn husks crunched loudly underneath her. The silence of the room began to ring in her ears, heavy and suffocating. The light creeping through the dust-caked glass of the window was turning bruised purple and dull orange. Evening was setting in. Abigail touched her jaw, wincing as a sharp flare of pain shot up to her temple. She was thirsty. Her throat felt like it was coated in ash. She looked at the ceramic wash pitcher in the corner, but she knew it was empty. She had drained it that morning. There was nothing left but the dry, cracked glaze at the bottom. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to the trading post 3 days ago. It was the only place she had felt a fleeting moment of safety all week. She had been hauling a sack of flour to the wagon when she dropped it, the heavy canvas slipping from her sweaty, aching fingers. He had picked it up. She didn't know his name then. The town gossips called him the Mountain Man, or the Savage, depending on who was drinking. He lived up in the high ridges of the Bitterroots, coming down only twice a year to trade beaver pelts and deer hides for coffee, salt, and ammunition. He had hoisted the 50-pound sack of flour with one hand, as if it weighed no more than a pocket watch. When she reached out to take it, her bruised wrist exposed from the sleeve of her calico dress, he didn't hand it over. He stopped. His hands were massive, scarred white across the thick knuckles, ingrained with years of dirt and pine pitch. He smelled like wood smoke, old leather, and a deep, raw cold that didn't belong in the summer heat. She had looked up into his face. It was a harsh face, weathered and deeply lined, a map of brutal winters and silent isolation. His beard was unkempt, brown streaked with early gray, but his eyes, they were a startling, pale, washed-out blue, like winter ice. He didn't offer a polite tip of the hat. He didn't smile. He just stared at the ugly purple-yellow bruises fingering their way up her forearm. Then, he looked at her face, reading the exhaustion, the flinching posture she couldn't hide. He didn't look at her with pity. Pity was cheap. He looked at her the way a man assesses a wounded animal in a trap, calculating, silent, and intensely focused. "Your man do this?" His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. It scraped against the air like two stones grinding together. "My father," she had whispered, instantly terrified that Josiah would step out of the mercantile and see her talking to him. The mountain man hadn't said another word. He just nodded slowly, carried the flour to the wagon, dropped it in the back, and walked away. His gait was heavy, but completely silent. A predator's walk. She had watched the broad expanse of his back disappear into the crowd, feeling a strange, confusing knot tighten in her chest. Now, sitting in the suffocating dark of her locked room, she pulled her knees to her chest. The memory was useless. A momentary interaction with a stranger who likely forgot she existed the second he spurred his horse out of town. Downstairs, the front door slammed open, rebounding against the wall with a crash that made her jump. Josiah was shouting, "We're closed up. Mercantile's shut. The house is private. Get off my porch before I fetch my scattergun." She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Nobody visited their house after sundown. Nobody. The town knew better than to deal with Josiah when the rye bottle was open. There was a muffled response from outside, a voice so deep it vibrated up through the floor joists into the soles of her boots. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was flat, completely devoid of the deferential fear her father usually commanded. Her heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stood up, creeping blindly toward the door in the dark, laying her palms flat against the wood. "I said get," Josiah roared. A chair scraped violently across the floorboards below. Then came a sound that made her blood run instantly cold. A wet, meaty thwack, followed by the crash of breaking glass, and the heavy, deadweight slump of a body hitting the floorboards. Silence rushed back into the house, thicker and more terrifying than before. The silence stretched so tight, Abigail thought her eardrums would burst. She pressed her ear against the door panel, holding her breath until black spots danced at the edge of her vision. Nothing. No groaning from Josiah, no footsteps retreating, just the wind whining through the cracks in the siding. A cold sweat broke out across her back, soaking the collar of her dress. He was coming, whoever it was. It might be Amos, impatient and drunk, coming to claim his property a night early. It might be a drifter who had just murdered her father for his lockbox. She scrambled away from the door, her hands frantically patting the darkness of her room. She needed a weapon. Her fingers brushed the ceramic wash pitcher. Too light. The tin cup, useless. She dropped to her knees, feeling under the mattress until her fingers closed around the heavy, rusted iron hook she used to latch the window shutters before Josiah nailed them shut. It wasn't sharp, but it was heavy. She backed into the furthest corner of the room, wedging herself between the wall and the heavy oak wardrobe. She raised the iron hook, her hands shaking so violently it chattered against the woodwork. Then, the stairs began to creak. It wasn't a hurried rush. It was a slow, rhythmic ascent. Creak, pause, creak, pause. The footsteps were impossibly heavy. They didn't shuffle like a drunkard's. They landed with a terrible, deliberate certainty. Her lungs refused to take in air. She was drowning in the dry heat of the room. The smell of fear was overwhelming now, sharp and sour. The footsteps reached the landing. They stopped right outside her door. She could see the faint yellow bleed of a kerosene lantern seeping through the crack beneath the door. The shadow of a massive pair of boots interrupted the light. The brass doorknob rattled. Once, twice. The deadbolt held fast. Abigail. The name came through the wood, muffled but unmistakable. It was the rough, scraping rumble from the trading post. The ice-eyed man. Her throat clamped shut. She tried to speak, but only a pathetic, raspy squeak slipped out. She swallowed hard, forcing moisture into her mouth. Who's there?" "Stand back from the wood." The command wasn't yelled. It was spoken with a quiet authority that brooked no argument. She didn't move. She was paralyzed, glued to the corner, the iron hook still raised. He came back. The thought was wild, impossible. Men didn't come back. Men didn't intervene unless there was something in it for them. What did he want? I said, "Stand clear." The voice was closer now. He was right against the door. She scrambled sideways, dropping the iron hook, covering her ears, and pressing herself flat against the adjacent wall. The first impact sounded like a cannon firing inside the small hallway. The heavy oak door bowed inward violently, the wood shrieking in protest. Dust and flakes of old white paint showered down from the doorframe. The floor shook beneath her. She clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. He wasn't kicking it. He was throwing his entire body weight against the solid wood. Crack. The second blow splintered the center panel. A jagged line of raw, pale wood tore through the painted surface. The iron deadbolt groaned, the screws ripping halfway out of the frame. It was terrifying. There was no romance in this violence. It wasn't a dashing rescue. It was a brutal, overwhelming display of sheer physical destruction. She watched the door buckling, realizing with sudden, nauseating clarity that the man breaking it down was infinitely more dangerous than the man who had locked it. She was trading a familiar cage for the jaws of a wolf. Smash. The door frame gave way. The metal strike plate tore through the splintering pine framing with a high-pitched metallic screech. The door blasted open, swinging wildly on its bent hinges before slamming into the inside wall and rebounding off. A cloud of wood dust and plaster rolled into the room, catching the harsh yellow glare of the lantern he held in his left hand. He stepped over the threshold. He had to duck slightly to clear the ruined frame. In the confined space of her bedroom, he looked monstrous. He was wearing a heavy canvas duster, stained dark with rain and grease, worn over a thick wool shirt. His broad-brimmed hat was pulled low, casting his eyes in deep shadow. He breathed heavily, a rhythmic, steaming exhale, though the room was stifling hot. His right shoulder was covered in white plaster dust. His knuckles, gripping a heavy hunting knife he hadn't bothered to unsheath, were scraped raw and bleeding sluggishly. He brought the lantern up, sweeping the light across the room until it found her, cowering against the wall, trembling like a beaten dog. They stared at each other. The air between them was thick with dust and the smell of ozone, splintered pine, and the sharp musk of male sweat. He didn't say, "You're safe now." He didn't offer his hand. He didn't look at her with any tenderness. He looked at her with the same calculating, intense gaze he had at the mercantile. His eyes dropped to the rusted iron hook lying on the floor near her feet. He looked back up to her face, noting the fresh, swollen bruise on her cheek, the dried blood on her lip, a muscle feathered in his jaw. That was the only shift in his expression. He reached over to the single wooden chair by her bed, picked up her heavy winter wool coat, the one she hadn't worn in months, and tossed it at her feet. It hit the floor with a soft thud. "Get your boots on," he said. His voice was level, empty of the adrenaline that must have been pumping through his veins. Abigail stared at the heavy wool coat on the floor. It was July. The heat in the room was still oppressive, sticking her thin cotton dress to her back. Her brain struggled to process the command. "Get your boots. We're leaving." Leaving? The word felt foreign in her mouth. Her voice was a broken whisper. To where? He didn't answer immediately. He set the lantern on the washstand, its yellow light throwing sharp, monstrous shadows of him against the peeling floral wallpaper. He slowly rotated his right shoulder, a wet popping sound echoing in the quiet room, dusting more plaster from his canvas coat. "Anywhere but here," he finally said, turning his pale, unblinking eyes back to her. "Unless you prefer the butcher." Her stomach dropped. How did he know about Amos? The town gossips must have been louder than she thought. The realization that her misery was public knowledge brought a flush of hot, humiliating shame to her cheeks. She looked at him. Really looked at him. The sheer mass of the man was terrifying. He was a force of nature, rugged and unpolished. A stranger, she was supposed to follow a man whose name she didn't even know into the pitch-black night? She hesitated. She looked past his broad shoulders to the ruined door frame. Beyond it lay the dark hallway. Beyond that, her father, Josiah, she stammered, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. My father. What did you do to him? The mountain man's expression darkened. It wasn't anger, but a profound, cold disgust. He's breathing. He'll have a headache for a week and a jaw wired shut for a month if he can find a doctor stupid enough to do it. Put the coat on, girl. My horse is getting restless, and I don't intend to be standing here when the town marshal wakes up. It was the harshness of his tone that snapped her out of her paralysis. There was no coddling, no false promises, just cold, hard reality. She was a problem to be solved, a piece of cargo to be moved, and yet it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she reached down and picked up the wool coat. She shoved her arms into the sleeves, the rough fabric immediately scratching at her sweaty skin. She sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled on her worn leather boots, her fingers clumsy with the laces. He watched her the entire time. He didn't rush her, but the weight of his stare was heavier than a physical push. When she stood up, her knees wobbled. The lack of water and food over the past 24 hours, combined with the sudden spike of adrenaline, made the room tilt slightly. She swayed, catching herself on the bedpost. He moved instantly. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his large hand wrapping around her bicep. His grip was firm, rough, calloused like dried bark. She flinched, her whole body tensing, expecting pain. He froze. He looked down at his hand gripping her arm, then up to her face, reading the flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he loosened his grip, dropping his hand away entirely. I won't pull you, he muttered, stepping back to give her space. But you need to walk. She nodded, swallowing the lump of fear in her throat. She followed him out of the room, stepping over the shattered remains of her door. The descent down the stairs was a nightmare. The house was silent, save for their footsteps and a wet, gurgling sound coming from the parlor. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw him. Josiah was slumped against the wall by the overturned parlor table. The rye bottle was shattered in a puddle of amber liquor and broken glass. Josiah's head was thrown back, his mouth agape. His nose was clearly broken, pushed violently to one side, and dark, thick blood poured down his chin, staining the collar of his shirt. His eyes were open, glassy and unfocused, tracking them as they moved. He tried to speak, tried to lift a hand, but only a wet, bubbling cough came out. She stopped. She couldn't help it. Years of conditioning, years of cowering beneath his shadow, rooted her boots to the floorboards. She looked at the man who had traded her for cattle, the man who had locked her away to starve. Pity, ugly and unearned, warred with a deep volcanic hatred in her chest. The mountain man stopped beside her. He didn't look at Josiah. He looked at her. Leave him, he said quietly. Josiah's gaze shifted to her. His eyes narrowed, swimming with a familiar, toxic rage. He raised a shaking, blood-slicked finger and pointed it at her. The gesture was a curse, a promise of retribution. Her breath hitched. She took a step back. Suddenly, the mountain man moved. He didn't draw a weapon. He just stepped directly between her and her father, his massive frame completely blocking Josiah from her sight. The physical barrier broke the spell. Look at my back, he ordered, not turning around. Keep walking. She did. She kept her eyes locked on the broad expanse of his canvas duster, following him out the front door and onto the porch. The night air hit her like a physical blow. It was late, and the punishing heat of the day had finally broken, replaced by the sharp, high desert chill that rolls off the mountains after midnight. She shivered, suddenly grateful for the heavy wool coat. Tied to the porch rail was the largest horse she had ever seen. A massive black draft cross, breathing plumes of steam into the cold air. The beast shifted its weight, its hooves clopping loudly against the packed dirt. The man untied the reins with quick, practiced movements. He turned to her. Can you mount? He asked. She looked at the saddle. It was a heavy, western rig, sitting impossibly high. She shook her head, her teeth beginning to chatter. Without a word, he grabbed her by the waist. His hands spanned almost the entirety of her ribs. He lifted her effortlessly, setting her sideways across the saddle in front of the horn. Before she could process the indignity of being handled like a sack of grain, he swung up behind her. The saddle creaked loudly under their combined weight. He smelled even stronger now, horse sweat, wet wool, and the metallic scent of Josiah's blood on his knuckles. He reached around her, his thick arms bracketing her sides as he took the reins. She sat rigidly, her back ramrod straight, terrified to lean back against his chest. "Hold onto the horn," he instructed. She gripped the leather knob tightly. He clicked his tongue, a sharp, wet sound, and the massive horse lunged forward. They didn't take the main road through town. He steered the beast off the property, cutting through the tall, dry prairie grass behind the houses, heading straight for the looming, black, jagged teeth of the mountain range in the distance. The town fell away behind them. The few scattered lights in the windows disappeared. They were swallowed by the absolute crushing darkness of the frontier night. The wind picked up, biting at her exposed cheeks and tearing at her hair. Every jolt of the horse sent a spike of pain through her aching jaw. She was freezing, terrified, riding into the unknown with a violent stranger. Her father was bleeding on the floor, and she had nothing to her name but the clothes on her back. She closed her eyes. The smell of pine and cold earth rushed into her lungs, clean and sharp. She was a prisoner, stolen by a savage. And yet, as the rhythmic motion of the horse carried them further and further away from the deadbolt, the smell of cheap rye and the claustrophobic heat of her room, she took a deep, shuddering breath. For the first time in her life, the air didn't taste like dust. Her fingers, locked around the saddle horn in a death grip, had stopped aching an hour ago. Now, they were just heavy, unresponsive blocks of meat. Every time, the massive beast beneath them lunged up a steep, rocky switchback, her spine compressed. Her jaw, swollen and throbbing from Josiah's backhand, pulsed in agonizing rhythm with the horse's heartbeat. She was leaning back against the mountain man. She hadn't wanted to. For the first 2 hours, she sat rigidly upright, fighting the incline, keeping a stubborn inch of freezing air between her spine and his canvas duster. But pride is a luxury of the warm and well-fed. As the elevation climbed and the wind began to howl through the narrow granite canyons, survival overrode her dignity. She let her shoulders slump back against his chest. He was solid as a felled oak, radiating a dense, furnace-like heat that seeped through the layers of their damp clothing. He didn't adjust his posture to accommodate her. He didn't wrap his arms around her to shield her from the wind. His forearms merely bracketed her ribs, his massive, raw-knuckled hands working the thick leather reins with a terrifying, quiet competence. She was nothing more than an awkward sack of flour wedged between him and the freezing air. Pine needles, sharp and stiff with frost, slapped against her exposed calves. The scent of the forest was intoxicating and suffocating all at once. Crushed juniper, damp loam, and the sharp medicinal tang of white pine sap. It was a wild, violent smell, completely devoid of the lye soap and stale tobacco that defined her father's house. "Lean left," he murmured. His voice rumbled directly through her shoulder blades. She obeyed blindly, shifting her weight just as the horse scrambled over a slick shelf of exposed shale. Sparks showered in the darkness as iron shoes struck flint. The beast snorted, a massive expulsion of steam, and leveled out onto a narrow game trail cut into the side of the ridge. To her right, the mountain fell away into an abyss of black timber. One misstep, and they would tumble into the dark. She closed her eyes, a wave of nauseating vertigo washing over her. She was a prisoner again, just in a different kind of cage. A cage made of endless wilderness and lethal drops. Her father had locked her in a room. This stranger was locking her into an environment where she couldn't survive 10 minutes on her own. The horse slowed to a halt. The sudden lack of motion jolted her. She opened her eyes, the bitter wind immediately watering them. They were standing beside a narrow ribbon of water, cutting through the frost-heaved rocks. It looked like liquid obsidian in the starlight. The man swung his right leg over the horse's rump and dropped to the ground in complete silence, the stirrup leathers groaning softly. He unlooped a battered tin canteen from his saddlebag and stepped toward the stream, crouching to plunge it beneath the icy surface. She sat frozen on the saddle, her legs trembling against the horse's sweaty flanks. The silence of the mountain was absolute, broken only by the bubbling water and the tearing sound of the horse ripping up mouthfuls of dry alpine grass. He walked back, water dripping from the canvas cuff of his coat, and held the canteen up to her. "Drink," She unhooked her numb fingers from the horn, her hand shaking so violently she nearly dropped the tin container. She brought it to her lips. The water was so cold it burned, a sharp metallic sting that hit the back of her throat like a handful of gravel. She swallowed greedily, the dehydration of the past 2 days catching up to her all at once. She took a second, massive gulp. A thick hand wrapped around the canteen, pulling it forcefully away from her mouth. Water splashed down her chin, soaking the collar of the wool coat. "Slow," he commanded, his voice flat, devoid of sympathy. "You'll vomit it straight back up. Your stomach is shrunk." She glared at him, a sudden, irrational spike of hatred flaring in her chest. She hated him for being right. She hated him for seeing her like this battered, starving, completely dependent. She wiped her wet chin with the back of her sleeve, wincing as the coarse wool scraped against her split lip. "Who are you?" The words tore out of her raw throat. They sounded pathetic, reedy, lost in the vastness of the canyon. "Why did you do this?" He didn't answer right away. He capped the canteen, hooked it back onto the saddle, and ran a hand down the horse's steaming neck, checking for lather. He moved with a deliberate, maddening slowness. Finally, he looked up at her. In the faint ambient starlight, his eyes were just dark hollows beneath the brim of his hat. "Name's Cole," he said. His tone suggested he was imparting a useless piece of trivia. "And I didn't do anything, girl. I pulled a drowning dog out of the river. Don't go biting the hand just because you're wet." The bluntness of it felt like a slap. He didn't see a woman to be saved. He didn't harbor some romantic notion of a rescue. He saw an animal in pain, and his practical nature simply couldn't leave a mess unattended. It was a brutal, unvarnished truth that stripped away whatever foolish, dime novel fantasies had been trying to take root in the back of her mind. "I'm not a dog," she whispered fiercely, her voice trembling with exhaustion. Cole stared at her for a long, heavy second. He looked at her swollen eye, her slumped posture, the way she was shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. "Then prove it," he said softly. He didn't offer to help her adjust her seat. He just grabbed the saddle horn, swung his massive frame back up behind her, and spurred the horse forward, deeper into the black timber. Bruised violet light bled over the jagged teeth of the bitter roots. It wasn't a sunrise. It was an autopsy of the night. The air at this altitude was starved and razor-thin, scraping down the back of her raw throat with every labored breath the draft horse took. They had climbed far beyond the heavy timberline. Here the pines were twisted, stunted gargoyles, beaten into submission by centuries of relentless alpine wind. Tucked against a sheer wall of granite sat a structure that barely qualified as a cabin. Unpeeled logs, thick with dried mud and gray moss, sat squat beneath a steeply pitched roof of heavy cedar shakes. No smoke unspooled from the stone chimney. It looked less like a home and more like a shallow grave. Cole hauled back on the thick leather reins. The beast snorted, a massive plume of white steam ghosting into the freezing air, and stopped dead. "Get down." His command was a low vibration against her spine. She tried. She really did. She stared at the scarred leather of the saddle horn, silently ordering her freezing fingers to uncurl. They refused. Hours in the plunging temperature had locked her joints into tight, agonizing knots of useless meat. She managed to slip her right boot from the iron stirrup, dragging her heavy leg over the horse's rump. But the second her weight shifted off the animal, her knees dissolved into water. She pitched forward into the empty air, bracing for the bone-shattering impact of the frozen dirt. It never came. A hand the size of a dinner plate clamped around the heavy wool of her coat at the scruff of her neck. He didn't catch her with grace or tenderness. He hauled her up like a stray dog, his other hand gripping her upper arm so hard her bruised biceps screamed in protest. He didn't hold her to his broad chest. He kept her at arm's length, waiting for her boots to find purchase on the earth. Her legs trembled violently, shaking her entire frame. She had to clutch the greasy, freezing canvas of his duster just to stay vertical. "Walk?" he grunted, letting go of her arm. He didn't open the heavy slab door with his hand. He kicked it. The heavy timber swung inward with a dull thud. Inside was a tomb. The air tasted of ancient wood ash, cured animal fat, and a deep, permeating frost. He steered her blindly through the gloom and deposited her onto a heavy chair carved from a single stump of yellow pine. She collapsed onto the unyielding wood, her teeth clicking together like castanets. She wrapped her arms around her ribs, trying to press the heat back into her own chest. Cole ignored her. He moved directly to the hearth with a predator's silent economy of motion. He didn't ask if she was broken. He didn't offer a blanket. He knelt, arranging a handful of dry, pale usnea moss and splintered fat wood. He struck a sulfur match against a hearthstone. The sharp, noxious hiss of the ignition bit the inside of her nose. Flames caught. They licked hungrily at the pitch, casting violent, leaping shadows across the mud-chinked walls. The sudden flare of orange light illuminated his face. Hard, unreadable, a map of scars and quiet violence. Only then did he cross the room to a wooden washstand. He poured water from an iron bucket into a chipped enamel basin. In the growing firelight, she finally saw the ruin of his right hand. Her father's heavy oak door had exacted a toll. Deep, jagged tears marred his knuckles, the tissue underneath raw and angry red against the dark purple bruising that crawled up his thick wrist. He uncorked a glass bottle with his teeth, spitting the cork onto the floorboards. He tipped the clear liquid directly over the open wounds. He didn't make a sound, but the thick muscles in his neck corded tightly, and a single wet pop echoed in the quiet cabin as he forced his fingers to curl into a tight fist. He wrapped a strip of coarse linen around the meat of his hand, tying it off with his teeth. He filled a dented tin cup from a cast iron kettle sitting near the fire, walked over, and shoved it into her shaking hands. "Pine needle tea," he stated. "Drink it all. It'll stop your blood from freezing." She brought the hot tin to her cracked lips. It smelled like turpentine and tasted intensely bitter, but the heat of it sliding down her throat was a revelation. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the warmth finally unknotting the terrified muscles in her chest. "Why did you bring me here?" Her voice was thin, raspy, but it didn't break. "You could have dumped me at the stage line in the valley." Cole dragged a three-legged stool near the fire and sat. He leaned forward, resting massive forearms on his thighs. Those washed-out, winter ice eyes pinned her to the chair. "With what coin?" he asked, his voice dripping with dry, humorless exhaustion. "You've got a swollen eye, no dowry, and nothing but the rags on your back. You think the frontier is kinder than Josiah Miller? A woman alone down there is just carrion. Amos the butcher would have been a mercy compared to what the rail camps would do to you." The truth of it was a physical blow. It knocked the breath out of her. Her naive, dime novel fantasies of a daring escape shattered against the cold rocks of reality. "So, I'm just your prisoner now," she spat, a pathetic flare of defiance burning through the exhaustion. She expected him to rise, to strike her, to show her the same toxic, ego-driven rage her father wielded whenever he was questioned. Cole didn't move. He just looked terribly tired. He lifted his left hand and pointed toward the heavy slab door he had kicked open. "Look at the wood, Abigail." She turned her head, her neck screaming in protest. She stared at the door. There was a heavy iron hinge. There was a thick wooden drop bar resting on a peg on the inside. There was no lock. There was no iron deadbolt on the outside. "I don't lock doors," Cole rumbled quietly. "You want to walk back down that mountain. Start walking. Nobody stops you. You want to freeze in the timber. That's your right. But if you stay under my roof, you work. You haul water. You split wood. You learn to bleed a rabbit without puking. I don't harbor useless things." He stood up, his broad shoulders blotting out the firelight, casting her back into shadow. "You aren't a wife here. You aren't a daughter. You're just a set of hands, trying to survive the winter. Can you handle that?" She looked at the beautiful, terrifying absence of a strike plate. She felt the agonizing throb in her bruised jaw, the hollow pit in her stomach, and the crushing weight of the wilderness pressing against the logs. It wasn't a rescue. It was a draft into a brutal war against the elements. She tightened her grip on the tin cup, feeling the heat sink into her palms. She looked up, meeting his pale gaze without flinching. "Show me where the water bucket is." That brings us to the end of Abigail and Cole's brutal, beautiful journey in the high country. Did she make the right choice, Trading a prairie cage for a harsh mountain winter? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If this raw, grounded Western romance kept you hooked, hit that like button, share it with a friend, and make sure you subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss our next story. Until the next trail, stay wild.
Hi, my name is William Sunny, the owner and manager of Iron Cowboy Gardena. After watching the video, father sent her father, locked the door against her. The mountain man broke it down and took her away. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the powerful contrast between fear and freedom. Abigail had spent so long living under control and intimidation that even the possibility of a different life felt frightening. Watching her step away from everything she had known and face an uncertain future took a kind of courage that really stood out to me. One gentle lesson I took from this story is that sometimes the hardest step is the first one away from a situation that is holding us back. Growth often begins when we choose the unknown over a place where we no longer belong. What did you think of Cole's decision to intervene? And at what point did you feel Abigail truly began to believe she could build a different future for herself? In our own lives, we may not face the same challenges, but we can still remember that small steps toward a healthier path can make a real difference over time. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these mountain man stories, feel free to like the video or subscribe to Iron Cowboy Gardena for more stories of resilience, courage, and hope.